In this session we're going to sample the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, and use this as an excuse to look at the book of Ruth as well. As I was with Moses, the opening salvo from Joshua, the story of Gideon, and the where you go, I shall go from the book of Ruth. So first of all, the first chapter of Joshua. The book of Joshua is about how Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land, leading them in conquering the existing inhabitants and in dividing up the land between the 12 tribes. If you'd read, please, the first 9 verses of Joshua. Verse 1. You'll remember that the Lord had responded to the grumbling in the desert by allowing a whole generation to die out apart from Joshua and Caleb before they entered the land. It seems strange, but even Moses was no exception to this. The Lord regarded him as having been in some way complicit in at least some of the people's sins. So he was allowed to stand on a hill and set eyes on the promised land, but he wasn't allowed to enter it. And it was at that point then that Moses died. Verses 1 and 2. Joshua had not only been one of the 2 good spies, he had also served as Moses' assistant, and now the Lord appoints him to take over. To enter the promised land they had to cross the river Jordan. Their route had taken them around the south end of the Dead Sea and north from there up the east bank of the Dead Sea. So to enter the land which was to the west of the Jordan, they had to cross back over the river. Verses 2 to 4. The Lord reassures Joshua of the fact of the promised land and of the extent of it. The boundaries as described here proved somewhat flexible over the centuries as neighbouring powers took bits of their land, and the Israelites sometimes won them back and sometimes didn't. Verse 5. When the Lord sets out to achieve something, it's not unusual that he selects one person to head it up, ensuring the success of what that person does. I think of some big evangelistic campaigns I've been to, where sometimes, to be honest, the preaching isn't all that up to much, but the people flock to become Christians, and it seems ever so clear to me that it's because the Lord has decided he wants to use the evangelist in that way, and it's the Lord's doing rather than something that the evangelist has generated by brilliant preaching. So Joshua was the one out front. He was the one that the Lord had set his purpose on for this time. But he had a big act to follow. I mean, Moses had a very close relationship with the Lord for a start. For much of the desert wanderings, he'd had a tent just outside the camp where he'd go to meet with the Lord, and his experience there was such that when he emerged, his face was absolutely shining. Now, if that was the deal under which Moses had operated, poor old Joshua, what chance was there for him? Verse 5. No one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life, because as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Wonderful. Verse 6. As well as making promises to Joshua, the Lord has to give him some clear instructions. Be strong and courageous. This is in addition to his undertaking that the Lord will resource him in his work. Joshua himself must take up what the Lord provides and, as a result, be strong. The run-of-the-mill Israelite won't be as clear about the help that the Lord is giving, won't be as ready to venture out in the light of it. And if Joshua is going to lead them, then he must have enough strength and enough courage to be able to carry those less dedicated people with him. That makes me think he's going to have to make some pretty stirring speeches now and then. Could do with Shakespeare to match the Henry V's speeches at Agincourt or on St. Crispin's Day. He's going to have to be an inspirational leader. Verse 7. If you're going to bet your life on this arrangement working, then you must make sure not to mess up your relationship with me. And your best guide to that is the law of Moses. Now, these days we, of course, have even more to go on. We've got the whole of the New Testament, plus a growing ability to read the Old Testament as something which leads up to Jesus. We can even build all our understanding of that on a procedure like what would Jesus do? I mean, Joshua had something more like what would Moses do? The Lord was encouraging him to take that sort of approach. When we've been commissioned by God to do something and we're careful to stick close to Jesus, we should expect his blessing on what we do. We should expect his protection while we're doing it. Verse 8. A technique for keeping close to the Lord is to read the Bible regularly. I think there's a lot to be said for reading it out loud. Sometimes you need to lock yourself away somewhere so that people near to you don't think you're going round the bend. But for the words of the Bible actually to come off your lips, I think has a power to it. Obviously, at the time of Joshua, virtually everyone who read did so out loud, or at least under their breath, and it's useful to us too. And unless you know the Bible, you won't be able to use it as a resource in sticking close to Jesus, and you need it. Verse 9, do not be terrified. It's a test of faith to say to someone who's about to lead an invasion, don't be terrified. Fear may come, of course, but it's your responsibility to deal with that fear in faith. Remember what the Lord has promised and insist on living in that promise. And then he says, do not be discouraged. I put a hyphen in the word discouraged after the dis. To be discouraged, if you hear the hyphen there, is to allow someone or something to take your courage away from you. And if the Lord tells you not to be discouraged, he's saying it's your responsibility not to let that happen. There will be whingers. There will be those of your own people who set out to ridicule you. It happened to Moses. Why shouldn't it happen to you as well? But don't let it get to you. Don't let that sort of treatment rob you of your courage. If you now read, please, verses 10 to 18. Verses 10 and 11. Joshua, the leader, turns these high and mighty things into practical instructions. Verse 12. It says in Numbers 32 that as the Israelites were approaching the river Jordan, while Moses was still with them, 2.5 tribes asked to settle there on the east of the Jordan, instead of having the hassle of the conquest. Moses was not pleased with the request, and he said that the Lord wasn't pleased with it either. He even extracted from them a promise that their men would share the conquest before returning to their flocks and families east of the Jordan once the conquest was over. So Joshua now reminds those 2.5 tribes of that promise, and it sounds as if he was quite stern with them. Verses 16 to 18. But they were quick with their response, quick to reassure Joshua that they would do as they'd promised Moses, and quick even to encourage Joshua in his leadership. So Joshua is ready to cross the Jordan and enter the Promised Land. Crossing the Jordan will be a sort of mini version of crossing the Red Sea, with the waters holding back while they cross. And then they will conquer the land. At least you'll remember, at the least, if they don't remember any of the rest of the story, you'll remember how Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho. But Joshua will lead them in dividing up the land between the remaining 9.5 tribes. And lastly, Joshua will lead a big national assembly at Shechem, in which he will call on them to decide whether they are going to make a job of following the Lord or not. And he leads off with that wonderful phrase, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Well, that's a lovely place to finish our first sample. Second sample from these books, we're going to take the story of Gideon from Judges chapters 6 and 7. It's strange that the heroes of this book called Judges are themselves called judges, and that it says that each of them judged Israel for however many years it was. They're in fact not judges at all. They're a selection of different kinds of heroes, mostly fairly wild and hairy. Think of Samson, for instance, but climaxing in Samuel, the man of God, the kingmaker. Of all of them, it says that God's Spirit was on them. Well, in this context, forget Galatians 5 and the fruit of the Spirit with all the gentleness and so forth. In these people, the Holy Spirit makes them powerful and heroic, rather than developing love, joy and peace and all the rest. Somewhere in the middle of the spectrum of the different heroes in this book is Gideon. If you'd like to read chapter 6, the first 6 verses. It's a pitiful situation. The people had wandered from the Lord, and he stood back to allow them to get into a mess, presumably so that they would want something better and turn back to him to ask for it. Mostly when you get the rough end of the Lord's treatment, it's to work for your repentance rather than just to punish you, and that seems to be what was happening here. The Midianites were making their lives hell, not least at harvest time. Hordes of men and livestock invading their territory, flattening or eating the crops, and the Israelites would often simply take to the hills and wait for the invading hordes to go away. Verse 6, the Lord was allowing this to happen, but his policy achieved its purpose, because at last they cried out to him for help. Now would you read, please, verses 7 to 10. So he sent them a prophet. Prophets aren't usually about foretelling the future. This one, in fact, only talks about the past, the exodus from Egypt and the people's unfaithfulness in the wake of it. Generations back into their family history, it's been marked by this unfaithfulness. Prophets are given the ability to see things as God sees them, and to communicate that to the people. And this one is clearly burdened with making sure that the people know the truth of the situation that they're in. Verse 10. It's a recurring theme of the Old Testament that worshipping the Lord cannot be combined with worshipping other gods. We're not Hindus, for instance, who have lots of other gods. Our relationship with the Lord is exclusive. As in marriage, it is engaged in forsaking all others. Would you read now, please, verses 11 to 24. In verse 11, we come across the angel of the Lord. In this part of the Bible, that usually is a way of referring to the Lord himself, come with a message to communicate. Gideon didn't dare thresh wheat out in the open, or the Midianites would come and steal it. Instead, he was doing it inside a building which housed a winepress, really awkward without the winds to blow away the husks. Verse 12. The Lord greets Gideon as a mighty warrior. This may strike you as a rather strange way of greeting someone who was hiding in a winepress. Perhaps his doing that was to some degree crafty, but it was also certainly done out of fear. Verse 13, Gideon at this point chooses to argue with the Lord is with you bit. I mean, how can it be that the Lord is with us? Surely we're living in the absence of God and the wretched presence of the Midianites. Verse 14, now it's clear that it's the Lord addressing him, and he commissions him to lead a revolt to purge the land of the Midianites. Verse 15, Gideon at this point turns his objections to his own unsuitability. How can a leader to accomplish such a task as that come from such an insignificant family as his and be the weakest man even in that family? It doesn't make sense. This is technically known as wriggling, trying to escape from what the Lord has told you to do. Verse 16. The Lord doesn't argue with him, but ministers to him with the assurance, "I will be with you," and the further assurance that in the light of that, Gideon will succeed in driving out the Midianites. Verses 17 and 18. Gideon, to be honest, isn't exactly won over, but he does realise that he's up against a strong man. So he asks to be allowed to set something up so that the Lord's reaction can be taken as a sign. When we feel that we've heard the Lord telling us to do something, it's usual for us to want some reassurance or some corroboration that we've heard it correctly. And Gideon was no different. But when we want some help, we can go to our Connect troop or to the elders of the church or whatever. He had no one to turn to in that way. So he asked for a sign. And in verses 19 and 22, Gideon prepared an offering of cooked meat and flour, and when he offered this, the Lord made fire burn it up. Quite a handy sign that something was happening that wasn't entirely in Gideon's imagination. Verse 22. At this point, Gideon actually gets the message. The person he's been talking to is the Lord. He's actually in it a bit deeper than he'd realised at first. Verse 23. You might expect quite reasonably that holy God plus sinful man amounts to a big explosion. But don't worry, I've got that in hand. Verse 24. Gideon then worshipped the Lord there. You read verses 25 to 32. Verse 25. The Israelites never completely drove the other nations out of the land. Then, as now, they shared the territory, uncomfortably often, with people of a very different culture and religion. The Canaanites who still lived there practiced a fertility religion, focusing on high places, closer to their God, on sacred groves, green equals fertile, and Asherah poles, very, very large phallic symbols. Gideon's father was in charge of their local high place. So the Lord told Gideon to take one of his father's bulls up to the high place, tear down the Asherah pole and the pagan altar that were there, build another altar for the Lord, and sacrifice the bull there using the wood of the Asherah pole for the fire. Verse 27. Now Gideon was only an apprentice mighty warrior at this stage, so he did obey the Lord, but he did so in the middle of the night when other locals were asleep. Verse 28 to 30. But of course after night comes morning. All hell broke loose. Eventually they learned that it was Gideon who'd done it, so they demanded that Joash, his father, should turn his son in. Verse 31. Joash played it really craftily. Without declaring himself either for Baal or for Yahweh, he got rid of them on the grounds that if Baal had any real power, he could surely deal with Gideon himself. Now if you'd read please verses 33 to 40. Gideon was set up to defeat a combined attack from neighbouring nations, but he still needed reassurance, hence the fleece. There are some people who seem to think that laying a fleece is a very spiritual thing to do. In this story, though, Gideon only laid the fleece because spiritually he was a wimp. Surely not something to be imitated. Well, that's all I've got to say on this sample, but to make sense of this incident, you could do well, actually, to go on now to read chapter 7, and I'll leave that with you. Our third sample is from the first chapter of the book of Ruth. Ruth is a standalone book. It's not part of the 6-volume work of history which goes from Joshua to 2 Kings. But as its opening lines declare, the story it tells is set in the time of the Judges, and so the book is usually placed here in our Bibles. A couple of verses from the genealogy in the beginning of Matthew's Gospel might interest you. Matthew chapter 1 verse 5. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed the father of Jesse. and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. According then to this genealogy, Ruth was David's grandmother, and therefore an ancestor of Jesus. Considering that she was a foreigner, this is remarkable. She is also one of the only 3 women to be named in Matthew's very male genealogy. But it seems she was a remarkable woman. If you read the first 2 verses, please. Verse 1, Bethlehem. Bethlehem is rather grandly called the city of David in Luke's nativity story, in the message of the angels to the shepherds. Judah, named after one of Jacob's sons, the territory which Joshua had assigned to the tribe of Judah. And in a time of famine, Elimelech took his family out of Israelite territory in search of food. Verse 2, they were Ephrathites. The village of Ephrath or Ephrata was near Bethlehem. Moab is on the east side of the Dead Sea, outside of Israelite territory. It was foreign country. Now read please verses 3 to 5. This is a sad sequence of events. There they were in a foreign land, and the family breadwinner died. Very nasty situation to be in. We don't know the ages of the 2 sons at this point, but obviously they had to become the breadwinners. Verse 4, it always has been important to the Jews and their ancestors to preserve the purity of their bloodline. Even the definition of who is a Jew is that it's someone who is born to a Jewish mother. But it seems that the 2 sons regarded themselves as getting on okay in Moab, and so they threw in their lot with that country, and after a while both of them married local girls. Verse 5. The sad story continues with those 2 young men then dying, and Naomi was left with the 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. Things were now desperate. In that society there was no way for a woman to have a job, except one that they would have rejected. So the 3 women were very clearly there with no means of livelihood at all. Verses 6 and 7, if you'd read them, please. As Naomi saw it, her only hope was to return to her own tribal territory in the expectation that someone in her extended family would make some sort of provision for her. This was certainly no time to be away from home. She was encouraged in this line of thinking by the news that the famine in Judah was at this time over. Verse 7, the little family then set out to return to Bethlehem, but it wasn't quite as straightforward as that. Perhaps the 2 younger women really ought to return to their own families and seek support there. It would seem they were still young enough to marry again, so perhaps back in their families husbands would be found for them. Now please read verses 8 to 13. Verses 8 and 9. So Naomi told them to go back to their families, and she prayed the Lord's blessing on them. They had joined themselves into an Israelite family, so she was confident that Israel's God would bless them. Verse 10. They both, however, protested that they now belonged with Naomi and would therefore stay with her. Verses 11 to 13, Naomi pressed her point. If they stayed with her, then being with her would provide no prospect of their finding new husbands, as they'd be better returning to their birth families. They should also not feel shackled to Naomi, as if they should be obligated to share her misfortune. That was hers to bear, and there was no need for them to be lumbered with it for the rest of their lives. So if you'd read verses 14 to 19. Verse 14, many tears, and Orpah did as Naomi said, and left her. But Ruth would not go, and I suspect that Ruth clung to her should be taken literally, arms around her mother-in-law, not wanting to leave her. So now Naomi's efforts are directed to persuading Ruth also to leave. And verse 16 and 17, here's the crunch. It's not clear what Ruth's motivation was, but there are various possibilities. One is possibly that she respected her marriage vows as having joined her to another family, so that was just as much her family as her own birth family had been. Another possibility is that perhaps the relationship between Ruth and Naomi was one that she didn't want to break. Almost then in selfish terms, it suited her to remain within that relationship. Or perhaps she had taken on some sort of belief in Yahweh as God and wanted to remain in that religion rather than go back to that of her family. You should assume that Moabite religion was some sort of earthy fertility cult, and Ruth could well have realized that she was into something of a better quality than that. Or perhaps, indeed, she stayed with Naomi out of some sort of pity. Perhaps, anyway, she was the kind of character who instinctually put her life at the disposal of others, and the obvious other was Naomi. We don't know. Perhaps the truth is a mixture of some or all of these possibilities. All we have to go on is the measurable behaviour that she stayed with Naomi, and the words that she used in pledging herself to do so, words which are both delightful and, in a sense, even blood-curdling. So the two stayed together and returns together to Bethlehem. Verse 19. I don't know how many years had passed since Naomi was last in Bethlehem, but it must have been quite a few, and during that time she'd been through the mill, to put it mildly, so presumably she had noticeably aged, hence the reaction of the local women, who were trying not to say, "Oh, Naomi, you're in a right state, aren't you?" But they were trying to be welcoming, but acknowledging that, in fact, they needed reassurance that it was the same woman. Verses 20 and 21, if you'd read those, please. You can imagine the quantity of chin-wagging which then went on with the local women, all of them more or less distant cousins of Naomi, or cousins by marriage. And Naomi obviously told them what she'd been through, and presumably this was therapeutic to Naomi to have the chance to let it all out to her kinswoman. And then if you just look at verse 22 as well, please. The note in verse 22 that the barley harvest was just beginning leads you into the rest of the story. Naomi discovered that a close relative of her husband, a man called Boaz, was both fairly well off and available, so she manoeuvred Ruth into Boaz's attention. And I get the impression that Boaz regarded it as no hardship to do his duty and to take this young woman under his wing. And they married and had a son. And if you move through to chapter 4 of Ruth at verse 17, it points out there that when they named the son they had, they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So a foreigner she might have been, but how could Boaz have found a better wife from among the Israelites? Ruth was the sort of character who was a great addition to his family, whatever nation she came from. A footnote. We've already had the cause to mention the significance of the firstborn when we were looking at the Passover. But this story is the next most celebrated occurrence of that idea in the Old Testament. In Hebrew, the firstborn is known as the Goel. When Naomi was looking for someone in her extended family to rescue their situation, she was looking for a Goel, someone who was the most senior in the family or thereabouts, and who could and would marry Ruth. Boaz was okay on both the could and would fronts, but he was aware that he wasn't the most senior in her extended family. So he gathered together some of the oldest men in the family, including the very oldest, who would usually be the family's Goel, their kinsman redeemer, as the NIV translates Goel. The upshot of the meeting was that the Goel was not okay on the could and was not okay on the would fronts, and the assembled company were all happy that Boaz should in that case play the Goel role to Naomi and marry Ruth. When Paul refers to Jesus as the firstborn of all creation, he's pointing to two things. The first is that as the eternal Son of God, Jesus has a claim to having been around before any other human beings, so in that sense the eldest in a very extended family. But the second, if anything is more important than that, is that Jesus was certainly okay on both the could and the would fronts. He had the capability of carrying out the Father's mission to rescue the human race, and he was willing to do so, despite the horrendous costs involved. And on both of those counts, Jesus, the Goel, is worthy of our admiration and worship. And that ends the third of our samples in this session.